The Futbol War. The name itself sounds almost like a dark joke, right? A war that started over a game. But back in the summer of 1969, for two neighboring countries, this became a deadly reality. Or did it? Let's unpack the story behind one of the most misleading names in history.
So, can a soccer match really start a war? It just sounds absurd. And the simple answer? No. But to get the real story, we do have to go back to the pitch, back to that moment everyone points to as the tipping point.
Picture it. June 1969, an electric, tense stadium. The roar of the crowd is just deafening. On the field, El Salvador and Honduras are battling it out for a spot in the 1970 World Cup. This is the image that history remembers as the trigger.
And then, just a few weeks later, this was the reality. The roar of the crowd was replaced by the crack of gunfire. The pitch became a battlefield. So how does a nation go from celebrating goals to digging graves? To find that answer, we've got to bust the myth.
All right, let's just tackle the myth head-on. That name, the Futbol War, it's catchy, it's easy to remember, but you know what? It's also deeply, deeply misleading. It's hiding a much darker story.
The truth is, while the games were definitely the spark, the powder keg had been filling up for decades. Blaming this war on soccer is ignoring these deep-seated issues of land, immigration, and economic inequality that were truly tearing these two nations apart. The match was just the final public stage for a conflict that was already about to blow.
Okay, so if soccer was just the spark, what was in that powder keg, the real causes? Well, they were a toxic mix of land, money, and politics, starting with a really simple but dramatic imbalance between the two countries.
It all starts on the map. Just look at these numbers from 1969. You've got El Salvador, tiny and packed with people, almost 170 people per square kilometer. Then, right next door, you have Honduras, 5 times bigger, but with just a fraction of the population density. This wasn't just a difference, you guys. This was a demographic pressure cooker just waiting to explode. And that pressure cooker had to release steam somewhere. For hundreds of thousands of Salvadoran peasants with no land and no future, the answer was obvious. They walked east. By 1969, an estimated 300,000 Salvadorans were living in Honduras. I mean, think about that. That's over 10% of the entire Honduran population. Now, for El Salvador's powerful elite, the handful of families who owned pretty much everything, this migration was a perfect safety valve. Instead of dealing with the massive inequality in their own country, they could just export their poorest citizens and the social problems they represented. It was a brilliant and frankly a cynical way to hold on to power.
But that safety valve was building up enormous pressure inside Honduras. Honduran businesses were getting crushed by cheaper Salvadoran goods, and Honduran peasants were watching their own land get farmed by migrants. Something had to give, and Honduras decided to act. They passed a land reform law that had one main target, those 300,000 Salvadorans. Mass evictions and violent deportations started, planting the seeds of some really deep resentment.
And it's into this explosive environment that the World Cup qualifiers dropped. Tensions were at a boiling point. With their countries ready to implode, the military dictatorships in charge of both nations pulled the oldest trick in the book, nationalism. And soccer provided the perfect stage.
Look, these weren't just soccer games. They were escalating provocations. Game 1 in Honduras. The Salvadoran team is terrorized all night. Game 2 in El Salvador. The Honduran team needs an armored escort to even get to the stadium. Their flag gets burned, riots break out. By the time the playoff match was played in Mexico City, it was already too late. The countries had already broken off diplomatic ties. War was pretty much inevitable at that point.
And caught in the middle of all of this? These guys, the players. They just wanted to play for their country, to fight for a spot in the World Cup. But their passion was being twisted into something ugly, a tool for politicians to fan the flames of hatred.
This was a slogan being broadcast in Honduras. Just think about that. Not some fringe comment, but a popular rallying cry. The media in both countries was hammering this kind of message home, turning neighbors into monsters. It wasn't about soccer anymore. It was about dehumanization.
On July 14, 1969, the rhetoric became reality. The conflict that followed was incredibly short, lasting just over 4 days, but it was also incredibly brutal. It became known as the 100 Hours War.
The two armies were a bit of a mismatch. El Salvador had the advantage on the ground, with a much larger army that pushed pretty quickly across the border. But Honduras had an ace up its sleeve, a superior air force.
So El Salvador's ground attack seemed successful at first, but then they literally ran out of gas.
The Honduran Air Force launched devastating counterstrikes on El Salvador's oil refineries and port facilities, basically crippling their supply lines. And this led to a fascinating piece of military history, the last ever dogfights between piston-engine propeller planes. We're talking World War II-era fighters like the Corsair and the Mustang, battling it out in the skies over Central America.
The fighting stopped after about 100 hours, thanks to a ceasefire brokered by the Organization of American States. But the consequences of this short, sharp war would echo through the region for decades.
The war only lasted 4 days, but the human cost was just devastating. About 4,000 people dead, most of them civilians, and a staggering number of people displaced, as hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans were forced to flee Honduras, creating a massive refugee crisis.
The political fallout was just as bad. The regional common market, which was this symbol of cooperation, it completely fell apart. The border wasn't formally settled for more than 20 years. And most tragically, back in El Salvador, the flood of landless refugees, combined with the government's new military might, created the perfect storm for an even bloodier conflict, the 12-year-long Salvadoran Civil War.
The great writer Eduardo Galeano captured the ultimate, heartbreaking truth of all this. This wasn't a war between two peoples. It was a war between two elites who used their people as pawns. The powerful lost nothing, while the poor lost everything, killing each other over problems they didn't even create.
So, the story of the football war is a powerful warning. It's a lesson in how the passion we feel for our country, our flag, or our team can be twisted and used against us as a distraction from the real problems like inequality and injustice. And that forces us to ask a crucial question. Where do we see that same playbook being used today?